Previously on Heartland, fire approached Hudson with terrifying speed, doubling overnight to within 25 miles of town. Mandatory evacuation gave 6 hours to leave. Amy faced impossible triage, 30 horses, space for only 18. 12 horses released into wilderness with fire approaching, including elderly Mare Moonbeam, who'd been at Heartland since Amy's childhood. Ty abandoned his veterinary office days after setting it up, leaving behind equipment and the professional identity he'd just reclaimed. Evacuation convoy crawled through smoke-filled highways to Calgary Emergency Shelter. The episode ended at midnight with Amy and Ty watching orange glow on northern horizon, fire visible 40 miles away, Heartland directly in its path. By morning, they'd know if 8 months of rebuilding survived or burned again. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Western Flavors. If you're enjoying this season, please hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a chapter. Last episode brought nightmare to life, mandatory evacuation, impossible choices about which horses to save, watching Heartland disappear behind smoke as they fled towards safety. Tonight brings the answer everyone's been dreading. Did Heartland survive the night? Did the barn they just completed withstand flames, or is it ashes again? Did the 12 released horses escape, or did they burn? Sometimes the hardest moment isn't the disaster itself, but the morning after, when you have to face what's left and decide whether you have strength to continue. Sometimes survival isn't victory, it's just the beginning of a different kind of suffering. Dawn broke over Calgary with sky that was still wrong, orange-tinged gray from smoke carried south on winds that had finally died down overnight. The exhibition center that served as emergency shelter held over 1,000 displaced people, and the atmosphere was thick with dread about what morning would reveal. Amy hadn't slept at all, couldn't sleep, had spent the night staring at the industrial ceiling while her mind replayed every possible scenario. Heartland burned to foundations, the barn collapsed, Ty's office incinerated, the 12 horses dying in flames, or impossible hope she barely let herself consider somehow. Miraculously, things had survived. She'd gotten up around 4 a.m. and wandered through the shelter past rows of families in identical situations, parents trying to comfort traumatized children, elderly couples holding hands and staring at nothing, teenagers scrolling phones, compulsively checking news updates, everyone waiting for the same information, what survived and what didn't. The shelter's atmosphere was oppressive. People spoke in whispers, as if normal volume would be disrespectful. Volunteers moved through offering coffee and breakfast that most couldn't eat. Red Cross had set up counseling stations, but they were overwhelmed. Too few counselors for too many people processing too much loss. Amy found herself near the livestock facilities where their 18 saved horses were housed. The animals were restless, sensing tension. She spent an hour checking each one, running hands over familiar bodies, grateful for these lives while thinking constantly about the 12 left behind. Returning to their cot area, she found Ty awake and staring at his phone. His face told her news was starting to come in, and it wasn't good. The first updates arrived around 6 a.m. through official channels and news crews that had reached Hudson with first light. The helicopter footage was devastating. Large sections of town were simply gone, completely incinerated, reduced to foundations and ash, block after block of residential neighborhoods erased. Downtown showed massive damage. Buildings Amy had known her entire life were rubble. But the fire had been capricious. Some areas were untouched, buildings standing pristine, while properties beside them had burned completely. There was no pattern, no logic, no fairness. Just wind-driven chaos that had sent flames in unpredictable directions. Lisa joined them around 6:30, tablets showing additional coverage. Each channel offered different angles of Hudson's devastation, but the message was consistent. The town had been catastrophically damaged. Estimates suggested 40 to 50% destruction. They're not showing rural properties yet. Too much smoke still obscuring northern sections. We won't know about Fairfield until we're allowed to return. The not knowing was torture. Bad news could be processed. Not knowing just churned endlessly, imagination creating scenarios from miracle to annihilation. Around the shelter, other families were learning their fates. Amy watched a young couple break down when aerial footage showed their street. Every house burned. Watched an elderly man collapse with relief when his neighborhood appeared intact. Watched a mother explaining to her 6-year-old that their home was gone. The trauma was visible everywhere. These were people already struggling through economic hardship, pandemic recovery, extreme weather stress, and now this home's destroyed, livelihoods erased, communities shattered. Lindy appeared around 7 a.m., having finally gotten maybe 4 hours of rest. Her first question was direct and devastating. Is Heartland gone? Amy pulled her close, unable to answer. They wouldn't know until they could return. Around 8 a.m., the announcement came Hudson residents could begin returning under escort starting at noon. 4 hours. 4 more hours of agonizing wait. Ty sat motionless on their cot, already bracing for worst-case scenario.
If Heartland burned, we're starting from zero again. The barn, my office, everything.
We survived the first fire. If we have to, we'll survive this one too.
But her voice carried no conviction. How much could they survive? How much loss could one family endure? Caleb and Ashley found them around 9 a.m., both looking shell-shocked.
Our apartment building was in the section that burned heavily. I think we lost everything.
My consulting business equipment, files, everything I've built, just gone.
The devastation in her voice was profound. She'd worked years to establish credibility, to build client base, to prove herself beyond being Val Stanton's daughter, and fire had erased it in hours.
Whatever happened, we face it together.
But the words felt hollow. Facing devastation didn't make it less devastating. The morning crawled toward noon with unbearable slowness. Amy tried to eat breakfast volunteers provided, but her stomach rejected food. Ty paced compulsively, unable to sit still. Lisa maintained composure through sheer force of will, but cracks showed in trembling hands and tight jaw. Around 11 a.m., families began gathering near shelter exits, preparing to convoy back to Hudson. The atmosphere was tense with dread and anticipation. Some would return to homes standing. Others would find empty lots. The randomness of who lost everything and who was spared felt cruel beyond measure. Noon arrived with official clearance to return. The drive north was surreal and devastating. They retraced yesterday's evacuation route but now approaching disaster instead of fleeing it. For the first 30 miles, everything looked normal. Green forest, living landscape. Then they crossed into the burn zone and normal ended completely. Green turned to black in matter of miles. Living forest became wasteland of charred skeletons. Trees that had stood for decades were reduced to blackened trunks. Branches gone, leaves incinerated. The ground was ash and charcoal, nothing living visible. It looked like nuclear test site landscape scoured of life. The highway showed fire damage. Guardrails had burned or melted. Road signs were warped or gone. The pavement was scorched, showing heat stress. Abandoned vehicles lined shoulders, cars that had broken down during evacuation. Amy drove with white-knuckled grip, processing devastation through windows. Ty sat silent beside her. Behind them, Lindy stared at apocalyptic landscape. This had been forest, had been living ecosystem. Now it was dead zone, evidence of climate crisis made tangible in ways statistics couldn't capture. Approaching Hudson, devastation became more defined and personal. Some neighborhoods were completely gone, block after block of foundations and chimneys standing alone amid ash. Other sections looked barely touched, as if fire had jumped over them through wind patterns and luck. They passed properties Amy recognized. The Morrison Ranch completely destroyed, nothing standing. The Chen family farm, barn burned but house survived. The Patterson place, everything gone. Each destroyed property represented life, altered permanently. Families starting over, children who'd lost homes. Elderly people facing rebuilding they might not have years or resources to accomplish. Downtown Hudson came into view and the damage was profound. Maggie's Diner destroyed completely. The community gathering place for decades reduced to rubble. The hardware store where they'd bought construction supplies burned to foundation. The elementary school where Lindy attended, partially standing but clearly damaged. Roof sections collapsed. The town Amy had known her entire life was fundamentally changed. Even buildings that survived showed smoke damage, showed stress. Hudson would rebuild, but it would never be the same.
I don't know if I can look. If Heartland's gone.
We look together. Whatever it is, we face it together.
Turning onto Heartland's access road, Amy felt nausea rising. This was it. Minutes from knowing whether 8 months of rebuilding had survived, the road showed fire damage, burned fences, charred trees, scorched earth. Properties on either side were devastated. The Morrison place they passed was completely destroyed. Nothing standing except foundations.
Pull over. Let me drive the final stretch.
Amy's hands were shaking too badly to argue. They switched positions and Ty drove slowly while Amy closed her eyes, unable to watch. Mom, look. The tone made Amy's eyes snap open. Heartland stood. The barn rose strong and intact against smoke-darkened sky. The house showed no fire damage. The structures they'd poured 8 months into were there, whole, miraculously spared. Amy felt sound escaping that wasn't quite sob, wasn't quite laugh, just release of tension so profound it was almost painful. They'd survived. Heartland had survived. Ty pulled into the driveway and stopped, unable to continue because tears blocked his vision. They sat staring at the barn that should have burned but didn't. After several minutes, they got out and walked property in stunned silence. The barn interior was exactly as they'd left it during evacuation. Ty's veterinary office held equipment still organized on shelves. The examination table stood ready. The pharmaceutical refrigerator hummed, having maintained power through emergency generators. It was all there, all intact, all impossible. But walking the property revealed the full picture. The barn and house had survived, but everything surrounding them bore scars. All fencing was destroyed, burned to metal posts and ash. Pastures were blackened wasteland. Trees at property lines were charred skeletons. The neighboring Morrison property had burned completely. Amy could see from Heartland's boundary that nothing remained. The flames had come within maybe 100 yards of Heartland before winds shifted and pushed fire in different direction. They'd been spared by pure chance, by random wind shift, by luck that had nothing to do with deserving. Lisa walked through the barn with expression mixing profound relief and guilt. We survived. Fairfield survived. But Jack's other property, the one I inherited from him, that burned completely. Everything there is gone. The loss hit fresh. That property had been Jack's investment, his backup plan, his legacy. And it was ash while Fairfield stood. Ty stood in his veterinary office, running hands over equipment like he needed physical confirmation. It was real.
It's all here. Everything I thought was lost. The office I abandoned thinking I'd never see it again.
But his relief was complicated by awareness of surrounding devastation. His office survived, but how many potential clients had lost their properties? How many horses had died? How many families would have resources for veterinary care when they were rebuilding from nothing? The immediate question, the one that had haunted every moment, was the 12 horses. Where were they? Had survival instincts saved them, or had they burned? Amy and Ty began searching immediately, moving through burned landscape, calling for animals that might be injured or hiding. The devastation was profound. Blackened earth extended in all directions. The ground was still warm in places. The smell was overwhelming, smoke and ash and burned flesh from wildlife that hadn't escaped. They found the first horse within 20 minutes. A young mare, 3 years old, standing in a creek bed that had provided refuge. She was alive but showed clear damage, labored breathing indicating smoke inhalation, singed coat, burns on her legs. She made it. She's alive. The joy in Lindy's voice was heartbreaking because they'd only found one of 12. Ty performed quick assessment with limited supplies he'd saved during evacuation.
Smoke inhalation. Obvious from her breathing. Second-degree burns on forelegs. Dehydration. But all treatable. She should make complete recovery.
They led the mare back to Heartland's barn, giving her water and hay and beginning treatment. 1 found alive, 11 still missing. The searching continued through mid-morning. They moved in wider circles, covering ground that had been forest but was now moonscape. The fire had been so hot it had consumed everything, not just vegetation, but topsoil itself. They found 2 more horses by early afternoon, both alive but traumatized. One stallion, 5 years old, had severe burns on his hindquarters from flames that had nearly caught him. The burns were serious, 3rd degree in places, but with aggressive treatment, his prognosis was reasonable. The second horse, a gelding, seemed physically fine at first. No visible burns, breathing appeared normal. But his psychological state was clearly damaged. He trembled constantly, eyes white with terror, flinching at every sound. The trauma of running from fire had broken something in his mind that would take time to heal. 3 found alive, 9 still missing. Then they found the first body, and reality delivered blow that knocked breath from Amy's lungs. An older gelding, 15 years old, who Amy had known since he was foal. She'd trained him, had ridden him through countless trail rides, had trusted him with Lindy when her daughter was learning to ride. He'd been gentle and patient and kind. And now he was dead, body lying in what had been pasture. Amy found him in early afternoon, recognizing him despite fire damage. He'd tried to outrun flames and failed. Smoke had claimed him first, small mercy, but dead regardless. Amy knelt beside him and wept, not just for this horse, but for the cruelty of survival's randomness. Why had 3 horses found safety while this one died? What determined who lived and who burned? Ty found her there and knelt beside her.
I'm sorry. He was good horse. Deserved better than this.
But deserving had nothing to do with survival. Fire didn't care about character or whether death was deserved, it just burned whatever couldn't escape. They covered the body with tarp from the barn, marking location for proper burial once they had resources. For now, acknowledging death was all they could do. The second body was discovered an hour later by Caleb, who joined the search after settling Ashley at Fairfield. A mare, 12 years old, who'd been trapped when fire surrounded her. Her death had been harder. Burns suggested she'd suffered before smoke finally claimed her. Ty made identification from dental records and remaining markings, then covered this body too. 2 confirmed dead, 3 found alive, 7 still missing. The searching continued through afternoon with help from neighbors who'd also returned to assess properties. Some offered to search their burned land for Heartland horses that might have fled there. Others were searching for their own animals, creating informal grid pattern across landscape. Around 4 p.m., they found another living horse. But this discovery brought no relief, only impossible decision that would haunt Amy forever. The mare was injured badly. 3rd-degree burns covered 30% of her body. Severe smoke inhalation shown by labored, rattling breathing, and infection was already setting in. The burns showed early bacterial contamination. Ty examined her thoroughly while the mare stood trembling, clearly suffering, pain-filled eyes looking at Amy with expression that felt like accusation. Ty pulled Amy aside, away from Lindy's hearing.
She's suffering. Burns this severe, smoke damage this extensive, infection this advanced, even with aggressive treatment, her chances aren't good. Maybe 30% survival rate. And that's with intensive care we don't have resources for right now. Between now and possible recovery, she'd be in severe pain despite medication.
Amy understood what he wasn't saying directly. They could try to save her, pour resources into treatment that would probably fail while the mare suffered, or end her suffering now, giving mercy instead of prolonging agony.
You're saying we should euthanize her.
Ty, I'm saying continuing treatment might be prolonging suffering rather than saving life. This is mercy call, not medical one. She's in pain, she's suffering, and our ability to relieve that suffering while attempting treatment is limited.
The decision was impossible. This mare could potentially survive. 30% wasn't zero, but it meant 70% chance of dying slowly and painfully. Amy made the call, and it destroyed something in her chest.
End her suffering. Don't let her hurt anymore.
Ty administered the injection with hands that were steady despite tears. The mare went peacefully, suffering ended, life concluded in burned field that should have been safe pasture. 3 confirmed dead now, 3 found alive, 6 still missing. Each death felt personal. These weren't statistics. These were animals Amy had known, had trained, had built relationships with. Each one gone represented history erased, connection severed, trust betrayed. By late afternoon, exhaustion forced them to stop searching. They'd covered miles of burned landscape, had called until voices were hoarse. 6 of 12 horses accounted for, 3 alive receiving treatment, 3 dead with bodies recovered. 6 more missing somewhere in burned wilderness. Moonbeam wasn't among the found, alive, or dead unknown. The elderly mare Amy had learned to ride on, who'd been at Heartland nearly 3 decades, was just gone. Might be alive, might be dead, might be suffering from injuries without intervention. The not knowing was torture worse than finding body would have been. At least death provided closure. This uncertainty meant Amy's imagination created scenarios ranging from miracle survival to suffering too profound to contemplate. That evening brought complicated grief as full scope of Hudson's devastation became clearer. Heartland had been spared, but the community had been shattered. The official statistics were staggering. 42% of Hudson had burned, 370 families homeless, 17 people dead, most from smoke inhalation, some from trying to defend property past safe departure time. The agricultural impact was catastrophic. Hundreds of animals dead, barns destroyed, equipment lost, families who'd been ranching for generations had nothing left. Lisa prepared dinner in Fairfield's intact kitchen. The disconnect between normal cooking and surrounding devastation was jarring. They ate in silence, none trusting themselves to speak. Lindy pushed food around without eating, processing trauma no 10-year-old should experience. Phone calls started around 6 p.m. as word spread that Fairfield had survived. Caleb confirmed his and Ashley's apartment building had burned completely.
We're homeless. Everything I owned fit in my truck when we evacuated. Everything else is ash.
You're staying here, both of you, as long as you need.
But survivor's guilt crushed her. They had house while hundreds lost theirs. The randomness felt like crime.
My consulting business equipment, client files, everything I built over years, all gone.
Her voice was steady, but devastation was clear. She'd worked to establish credibility, to build beyond being Val Stanton's daughter, and fire had erased it. Around 7 p.m., official assessment came through emergency alerts. Recovery timeline estimated in years. Some families would rebuild, others would leave unable to face starting over. The community was fractured between those who'd lost everything and those randomly spared. The division would create tensions for years, survivors' guilt on one side, resentment on the other. Night fell with unsettling normalcy. Temperature dropped. Stars appeared. And around 9 p.m., coyotes began howling, predators moving into devastation, hunting for weakened prey. Amy stood on Fairfield's porch, listening to coyote chorus and thinking about 6 missing horses. If they were alive, they were vulnerable. Injured horses couldn't run from predators. Horses separated from herd were easier targets. Moonbeam was 28 and arthritic. If she'd survived fire, could she survive coyotes? The questions had no comforting answers. Ty joined her, both listening to predator sounds.
The 3 we found are stable. Burns manageable. Smoke damage responding to treatment. They should survive, but the 6 still missing.
He didn't finish. With each passing hour, survival chances decreased.
I keep thinking about Moonbeam. I sent her into wilderness, telling myself it was giving her chance, but I sent her to die.
You gave her only chance she had. Trapped in barn, she'd have died for certain. Released, she had possibility of survival.
Slim possibility isn't comfort when I'm listening to coyotes hunt and knowing she's out there somewhere.
Inside Fairfield, Lisa was settling Lindy for bed. Caleb and Ashley were in guest room processing loss of everything they owned. The 3 rescued horses were in barn being monitored for complications. And somewhere in burned wilderness, 6 horses remained missing. 6 lives unaccounted for. 6 futures uncertain. Midnight found Amy unable to sleep. She left the bedroom where Ty was finally resting and walked to the barn, needing to see it again. The barn stood strong under stars that were unusually visible now that smoke had cleared. New walls, new roof. Ty's office with equipment he'd thought lost forever. 8 months of work had somehow survived. But standing there, Amy felt no triumph, just hollow relief complicated by crushing guilt. Why had they been spared when neighbors lost everything? The 3 rescued horses were resting in stalls, recovering from injuries. Their breathing was better from treatment. Burns were clean and bandaged. Prognosis good. 3 lives saved out of 12. Was that victory or failure? Through barn doors, devastation was visible even in darkness. Burned fences, blackened earth, charred trees, and beyond visual range, 6 horses still missing. Amy heard coyotes again, closer now, emboldened by darkness and hunger. The sound made her skin crawl, made her want to run into wilderness screaming until she found missing horses or collapsed. But she couldn't search in darkness, couldn't risk getting lost in landscape that looked identical, now that fire had erased landmarks, couldn't do anything except stand in intact barn listening to predators hunt. She thought about Moonbeam, the mare who'd taught her to ride, who'd carried her through childhood, who'd been constant presence. 28 years old, arthritic, gentle, irreplaceable, somewhere in burned wilderness, alone or dead, suffering or at peace. The not knowing was torture, worse than confirmed death because it prevented closure, prevented mourning, prevented moving forward. Ty found her around 1 a.m. and wrapped arms around her.
We survived. That's supposed to feel like victory. But it just feels like we got lucky while others got destroyed.
42% of Hudson burned. 370 families homeless, 17 people dead, and we're standing in intact barn, feeling guilty for being spared.
Survivor's guilt is real. We didn't do anything to deserve survival, but we also didn't do anything to deserve loss. It was just wind and chance that saved us while destroying neighbors.
How do we live with this? How do we accept we have home when friends are homeless?
The questions had no good answers, just reality of standing in barn that survived while listening to coyotes hunt where 6 horses remained missing. They stood together until after 2 a.m., then returned to house because sleep was necessary. The the 3 rescued horses would survive. The 3 confirmed dead would be buried with dignity. The 6 missing would be searched for at dawn. But tonight there was only waiting, only predator sounds, only smoke-tinged air and knowledge that morning would bring either survivors or more bodies. Heartland had survived, but the cost was measured in neighbors' losses, in animals released to wilderness, in landscapes scarred for decades, in community shattered by destruction that hadn't discriminated based on deserving. Fire didn't care about fairness or suffering or human capacity to endure. It just burned what couldn't escape and spared what happened to be beyond reach when winds shifted. And the living were left to process survival that felt less like victory and more like prolonged suffering that would haunt them in forms of memory and guilt and terrible knowledge that they'd been saved while others burned through nothing more meaningful than chance. The episode ends with Amy and Ty standing in the miraculously intact Heartland barn at 2 a.m., listening to coyotes howling in burned wilderness where 6 horses remain missing, including beloved Moonbeam. 3 horses found alive are recovering from injuries that should heal. 3 have been confirmed dead, including one Amy had to euthanize after burns and smoke damage made survival unlikely and continuation cruel. 6, including Moonbeam, are still unaccounted for, possibly alive, possibly dead, possibly suffering beyond reach while predators hunt through devastation. Heartland survived against all odds, spared by random wind shift while neighboring Morrison property burned completely. 42% of Hudson is destroyed. 370 families are homeless. 17 people are dead. Hundreds of animals are gone. Caleb and Ashley lost everything. Their home, belongings, Ashley's business equipment destroyed. Survivor's guilt crushes Amy as she tries to process being spared while neighbors lost everything. The barn stands strong, but victory feels hollow surrounded by such profound loss and uncertainty. Morning will bring continued search for missing horses, but tonight brings only the sound of predators and the terrible knowledge that each night in wilderness increases the chances the missing horses won't survive to be found. The coyotes' howls echo through burned landscape, promising additional heartbreak beyond what fire already took. Next time on Heartland, dawn brings renewed search with devastating discoveries, more horses found, but in what condition? Moonbeam's fate is finally revealed in a moment that will shatter Amy completely. The 3 rescued horses face medical complications that test Ty's skills with limited supplies. Community begins confronting massive rebuilding while coordinating aid for hundreds left with nothing. Amy and Ty face impossible decision about resources, help homeless neighbors or focus on recovering missing horses. Tensions rise as survivor guilt transforms into conflict, and in burned wilderness, discovery is made that raises terrifying question. Was this natural disaster or was fire deliberately set? Investigation begins that could change everything about Hudson's destruction.